The silent melody of fear. We all carry a secret sound. It is not the noise of the city or the rhythm of the clock. It is the constant low hum of anticipation, the melody of what if. This melody is the pervasive soundtrack of the modern soul, composed not of instruments, but of avoidance. Fear, in its truest manifestation, is rarely a sudden scream. It is the quiet, continuous erosion of choice. We believe we are navigating life actively, making conscious decisions, but too often, we are simply moving to circumvent obstacles that haven't even materialized. We live on the defensive, operating under the assumption that protection is the highest form of freedom. We build walls around our hearts and our livelihoods, forgetting that sometimes the structure we construct to keep the external threat out becomes the very prison that locks our potential in. This subtle, intellectualized fear is the defining characteristic of our age. Look closely at the canvas of modern existence. The tangible threats, the literal beast in the tall grass, are largely gone. Yet the anxiety quotient has never been higher. We are paralyzed by the abstract, economic collapse, social rejection, professional humiliation, the simple, devastating failure to measure up. This is the new geography of terror. We are masters of prediction, mapping out every possible deviation, every possible shame, and in doing so, we spend our present currency paying interest on future imagined debts. We are shackled not by chains, but by possibility. We accept this burden as inherent to the human condition, as the unavoidable price of consciousness. We are taught that this anxiety is functional, that it keeps us safe, competitive, and moral. But what if this acceptance is merely an intellectual surrender? What if the constant need to prepare for the worst is actually the most comprehensive way to ensure that we never truly live the best? There is a radical alternative, one offered centuries ago by a man grinding lenses in the quiet solitude of Amsterdam. Baruch Spinoza. His philosophy is perhaps the most challenging and simultaneously the most liberating system ever devised for achieving emotional autonomy. Spinoza cuts through the drama, cuts through the morality, and states plainly that fear is neither a virtue nor a useful instinct when dealing with abstract reality. Fear, to Spinoza, is nothing more than ignorance. It is the result of insufficient thinking. When we fear something, whether it is a market crash or a deeply personal rejection, it means we do not understand its causes, its necessity, and its connection to the infinite, immutable order of the universe. We view ourselves as exceptions, isolated, fragile islands buffeted by random storms of chance. But the storm is not random, it is necessary. And if we can achieve the intellectual clarity required to grasp the necessity of all things, then the passion we call fear dissolves. It is replaced not by reckless courage, but by an intellectual acceptance, a deep clarity that Spinoza termed the intellectual love of God, which is simply the love of things as they fundamentally are. Spinoza's radical formula for emotional freedom rests on two critical and mutually dependent intellectual movements. The first is the rigorous scientific recognition that every event in the universe, including our own pain and suffering, follows precise, immutable laws. Nothing happens by accident. The universe is not playing games, it is following its nature. The second and far more difficult movement is the transition from being a passive spectator, a victim of passions, to becoming an active participant, a source of action. When we are governed by passions, by the reactive pull of fear, envy, or rage, we are being acted upon by external forces we do not comprehend. We are puppets on strings pulled by our own confusion and our inability to trace an effect back to its true cause. We suffer because we imagine we are independent agents floating free in a chaotic sea. Freedom, true freedom, is not the ability to choose your circumstance. It is the ability to act based on an internal and rational understanding of what must be. We don't eliminate the external event, the loss, the disappointment, the danger, but we eliminate the internal chaos it used to generate. We cease reacting based on impulse and begin responding based on knowledge. We replace the anxiety of the unknown with the profound, steady serenity of the understood. We stop begging the universe for mercy and start observing its iron logic. To stop living in fear, then, is not about finding courage in the face of danger. That is temporary bravado. It is about demanding intellectual clarity in the face of confusion. It is about recognizing that the map of necessity is not a prison sentence, but the only honest blueprint for a liberated existence. It is the quiet, revolutionary act of withdrawing the massive energy we spend on rehearsing what if, and investing it entirely in embracing what is. This clarity is the single most powerful tool for achieving emotional mastery. The geometry of emotions. We ended the last block facing a profound realization. The architecture of human suffering is built not upon the physical reality of events, but upon the chaotic, unexamined ideas we attach to them. If the universe does not revolve around us, if there is no grand, personalized destiny, then what becomes of hope? What becomes of free will? It is here, in the cold, logical light of 17th century Amsterdam, that Baruch Spinoza offers a solution so terrifyingly rational it becomes the ultimate path to freedom. His philosophy is a radical surgical procedure performed directly on the human soul. He looks at the tempest of human feeling, the jealousy, the regret, the paralyzing fear, and declares them to be not moral failings but simply necessary effects, governed by the same immutable laws as the falling of a stone or the movement of a celestial body. For Spinoza, we are not sinners, we are simply confused. We are, in his radical terminology, slaves. Slaves to fortune, slaves to circumstance, slaves to our own passions, until we understand the precise mechanism of our bondage. To conquer fear, you must first define it with the cold, hard rigor of geometry. Spinoza's genius lies in defining emotion, or affect, with the rigorous precision of mathematics. Fear, sorrow, regret, and disappointment are not the result of malice directed at us by the external world. They are passive emotions, defined entirely by the condition that our power is diminished or hindered by external causes. When we are fearful, we are essentially reacting. We are victims of contingency. We are being acted upon. We believe we fear the future, but what we truly fear is the lack of control over the causes of our future. We fear randomness. We fear inadequate ideas. Spinoza's radical formula for emotional freedom hinges on the distinction between an adequate idea and an inadequate one. An inadequate idea is partial, confused, and incomplete. It is rooted entirely in the senses, the imagination, and the distorted perspective of the individual ego. When we are consumed by a passive emotion, like rage, or profound sorrow, or baseless anxiety, we possess an inadequate idea of the true, necessary cause of the event. We see the effect, but we misunderstand the chain of causality that produced it. These inadequate ideas make us slaves, reacting blindly to shadows projected onto the cave wall of our mind. Emotional freedom, for Spinoza, is not the suppression of feeling. It is the intellectual transformation of feeling. It is the arduous journey of moving from passion to action. When we achieve a comprehensive intellectual grasp of the cause of an external event, that the storm was not sent to punish us, but is simply the necessary effect of atmospheric pressure, that the tragedy was not a cosmic debt collected, but the inevitable culmination of prior causes, the emotion shifts. The fear loses its power. Why? Because fear is predicated on the idea that things could have been otherwise. Fear is the anguish that comes from clinging to contingency. When the intellect, however, grasps the necessity of the event, when the idea becomes adequate, the individual realizes that their sorrow or their anxiety is not caused by the external event, but by their own confused understanding of it. The power to overcome the suffering, therefore, lies entirely within the intellect itself. We stop living in fear of external forces because we realize that those forces, when adequately understood, are simply the mechanism of nature, or God, unfolding. The only true loss of power is self-inflicted ignorance. Spinoza teaches us that the highest human good is joy. not fleeting hedonistic pleasure, but the profound intellectual joy that comes from realizing our own power, our own capacity to act based on perfect understanding. This is the moment we stop being puppets of fortune and start aligning ourselves with necessity. Stop living in fear. Fear is optional. It is the byproduct of insufficient knowledge. Spinoza demands that we embrace the totality of existence, including the pain, not through resignation, but through radical comprehension. When we see ourselves as a necessary part of the infinite unified order, when we recognize that our individual actions flow from the same ultimate power as the stars, the paralyzing grip of fear dissolves. We are no longer afraid of the universe because we realize we are the universe contemplating itself. This is the intellectual love of nature. This is freedom. This is the geometry of the emancipated mind. God or nature, the stage of everything. If God is nature, and nature is governed by strict, eternal, and unchanging laws, then the entire human struggle against fate begins to look incredibly futile. This realization is not meant to paralyze us, it is meant to liberate us. Spinoza believed that understanding this system, this single substance, is the only path to true human freedom, outlined in his magnum opus, the Ethics. He saw the vast majority of humanity as living in a state of emotional servitude. We are prisoners, not of walls, but of our own passive reactions to external forces. We are driven by hope and fear. Hope, Spinoza notes, is nothing more than an inconstant joy, born from an inadequate idea of a future event we desire. Fear is the mirror image and inconstant sadness, born from the inadequate idea of a future event we dread. Both are predicated on uncertainty, on the deep-seated superstition that events are contingent, that they could simply happen or not happen, based on some external, unpredictable will. This vulnerability, this constant dependence on the unknown, is what prevents us from being truly free. We seek refuge in ritual, in superstition, hoping to bargain with a capricious deity to secure a favorable outcome. But if God is nature, there is no capricious will. There is only necessity. Spinoza's radical formula for emotional freedom is profoundly simple. To stop living in fear, we must move from passive emotional states, the passions, to active emotional states, the actions. A passion is an emotion that happens to us. We are sad because something external has diminished our power to act. An action is an emotion that flows from us, driven by clarity and reason. How do we achieve this transition? By forming clear and distinct ideas about the causes of our suffering. When we are overwhelmed by anger, sadness, or regret, we are experiencing inadequate ideas. We are seeing events as isolated, arbitrary misfortunes directed specifically at us. We rage against the unfairness of the world precisely because we imagine the world could have been otherwise. But the moment we trace that event, that disappointment, that loss, back to its eternal, necessary place in the infinite chain of cause and effect, its emotional power over us begins to dissolve. An emotion which is a passion ceases to be a passion as soon as we form a clear and distinct idea of it. This does not mean we cease to feel sadness or joy. It means we stop being enslaved by them. We accept that these events are not random acts of divine malice, but the inescapable unfolding of nature's own logic. The pursuit of freedom is therefore the pursuit of intellectual understanding. The ultimate goal is not detachment, but a specific form of attachment, the Amor Intellectualis, the intellectual love of God. This love is not about praying for blessings or rewards. It is the joy that arises when the mind understands itself and all things as necessarily existing within the framework of God or nature. It is the realization that our very existence, our striving to persist, our Conatus, is nothing less than the power of God expressing itself through us. When the mind achieves this understanding, it is no longer worried about its beginning or its end. It stops thinking of death because it understands itself as part of the infinite and eternal substance. It recognizes that its essence is not tethered to transient physical survival, but to eternal participation in the system of necessity. The free man, Spinoza insists, thinks of nothing less than death, and his wisdom is a meditation not on dying, but on living. This is Spinoza's true revolution. He strips God of personality and intention, removing the unpredictable tyrant who demands sacrifice and obedience. In its place, he gives us the magnificent self-governing machine of the cosmos, a system so perfect and necessary that its very logic becomes the source of our serenity. Fear vanishes not when we conquer the world, but when we finally understand it. Emotional freedom is intellectual clarity. We stop living in fear the moment we accept the stage upon which everything is set. Leave your like. What is Conatus, the force that moves us? We have journeyed deep into the geometric structure of human emotion, dissecting how external forces shape our sorrow and our joy. But now, we must ask the most fundamental question. What is the engine that drives this entire mechanism? What is the raw, inescapable urge that defines existence itself? Spinoza gives it one word: Conatus. It is one Latin term that encapsulates the blueprint for every thought, every action, every aspiration, from the smallest bacterium to the most complex civilization. Conatus is the enduring, inherent striving by which each thing endeavors to persist in its own being. It is not merely self-preservation, though it certainly includes that. It is the fundamental force of persistence. If a stone is thrown, its Conatus is the inertia that keeps it flying. If a river flows, its Conatus is the unceasing pressure to find the sea. And if you are alive, your Conatus is the will, conscious or unconscious, to continue maximizing your existence, to continue affirming the power that you are. This striving, this inherent energy, is your very essence. The mind and the body are not two things battling for control. They are simply two different expressions, two sides of the coin, for the same persistent striving force. When the body strives, the mind strives. When the power of the body increases, the clarity of the mind increases. This concept provides Spinoza's astonishingly clean definition of emotion. Our feelings are not mystical moral judgments or heavenly gifts. They are quite simply indicators of the health and power of our Conatus. When we encounter something, an idea, an event, another person, that aids our power of striving, that helps us persist, that increases our ability to act, we feel joy. Joy is the experience of transition to a greater perfection, an upward surge in our vitality. Conversely, when something diminishes our striving, when our power to exist is frustrated or lessened, we feel sadness. Sadness is the transition to a lesser perfection, a withdrawal of power. Every complex emotion we identify, envy, hatred, love, ambition, is merely a composite variation of these two primal states, linked by the mind to an external, often misidentified cause. Fear, for instance, is nothing more than sadness concerning a future, uncertain evil. It is the imagination running ahead of reality, predicting a decrease in Conatus. If our primary, necessary directive is to persist, if we are fundamentally bundles of striving energy, why do we spend so much of our lives paralyzed by fear? Why do we suffer such debilitating inertia? We are trapped in what Spinoza called bondage. We live reactively, driven by external contingent causes. We fear death, loss, public judgment, economic collapse because we perceive these external forces as stronger than our internal Conatus. We imagine these forces might rob us of our persistence. Spinoza's radical formula for emotional freedom is this: fear is a lack of understanding. We suffer because we have confused adequate, clear ideas about necessity with inadequate, confused ideas about contingency. We see tragedy and loss as arbitrary, random assaults, things that might happen, plunging us into panic and superstition. But when we rise to the level of true understanding, we recognize the necessity of the universe. Everything that happens is the necessary outcome of nature's eternal, seamless laws. Nothing is arbitrary. Everything is compelled. When we grasp this, we stop living as passive puppets driven by shifting external winds and become active agents, driven by an internal, intellectual understanding of necessity. The moment we understand the cause of our sadness, the sadness ceases to be a passion and becomes an idea. This highest level of clarity, seeing all things, including ourselves, as necessary parts of the infinite chain of cause and effect, is what Spinoza termed the intellectual love of God, or more truly, the intellectual love of nature. It is the realization that the power that constitutes your being is the same power that constitutes the totality of existence. The aim is not to conquer fear through sheer willpower, but to transcend it through knowledge. To know yourself is to know your Conatus, and to know your Conatus is to understand that you are not separate from the divine necessity of nature. Your striving is the universe's striving. When you realize that your essence is the persistent power of being, the paralyzing grip of external fear dissolves. You stop living against the world and start living as the world. This is the radical freedom Spinoza offers. Stop striving to avoid loss. Start striving simply to be. For the force that moves you is, by definition, the force that persists. The illusion of free will. We began this journey searching for the source of our choices, but sometimes choice itself feels like the heaviest burden we carry. We are conditioned to fear the unpredictable. We fear failure, loss, the judgment of others, because we operate under the crushing delusion that every outcome, good or catastrophic, rests entirely on our individual, uncaused will. This is the seed of anxiety, the feeling that we are entirely responsible for steering a ship in a storm we did not create, a storm which operates outside the laws we understand. This is where Baruch Spinoza steps in, offering one of the most intellectually demanding, yet ultimately comforting visions of human existence ever conceived. Spinoza offers a radical formula for emotional freedom, not by giving us more control, but by fundamentally redefining what control even means. His premise is simple and absolute. There is no free will in the conventional sense. Everything that happens necessarily. The universe, which Spinoza names God or nature, is a single, unified, infinitely complex system of cause and effect. It doesn't choose, it just is, eternally manifesting its own necessary nature. Our suffering, our deepest passions, our sadness, our debilitating fear is fundamentally rooted in what Spinoza termed inadequate ideas. We suffer because we imagine we are independent agents acting upon an indifferent external world. We see an event, a tragic accident, a sudden reversal, and we perceive it as arbitrary, a random assault upon our perfect plan. We assign the cause to fate or malice or our own personal failing. A passion, in Spinoza's system, is merely an idea of a state where we are the effect, not the cause. When we fear, we are passively reacting to an external force whose true mechanism we do not comprehend. Fear, then, is simply the intellectual ignorance of necessity. If we do not know the causal chain, we feel profoundly powerless. We are driven by forces we cannot name, like a sailor thinking his ship steers itself simply because he is unaware of the wind and the tide. Spinoza argues that true freedom is not the power to break the chain of causality, but the power to understand it. Freedom is not about making things happen differently. It is about knowing why things must happen the way they do. The moment we move from an inadequate idea, the feeling of being attacked by chance, to an adequate idea, the understanding of the eternal laws of nature that govern that event, the emotion fundamentally changes. When the mind grasps that an event, however painful, is a necessary manifestation of the infinite substance of nature, the passive suffering transforms into active acceptance. We stop asking, "Why me?" and start understanding, "This is what must be." We stop being slaves to fortune and become interpreters of the cosmos. This intellectual acceptance is the highest state of human flourishing, the intellectual love of God, or Amor Intellectualis. It is a love born not of piety or ritual, but of pure crystalline comprehension. It is recognizing that your own necessity, your own existence, is woven into the very fabric of the divine, deterministic mechanism. If everything is necessary, then nothing can be otherwise. The burden of ultimate arbitrary responsibility lifts. The paralyzing fear of what if dissolves into the tranquil certainty of what is. We are not afraid of the world because we recognize that the world is us, operating according to its own immutable, perfect logic. To live without fear is to stop fighting the reality of existence. It is to recognize that we are not broken pieces struggling against a great machine, but necessary parts of the machine itself. The highest freedom is simply this: to understand your place in the infinite, to know that you are not merely free to choose, but free from the terror of believing you must shoulder the weight of an entire universe. And this knowledge is the radical formula for emotional and existential liberation. Fear, the shadow of uncertainty. There is a shadow that stretches over the human experience, a cold, insistent presence that dictates our movements, censors our thoughts, and diminishes our capability before the challenge has even materialized. This is the shadow of uncertainty, and its name is fear. We spend so much time discussing fear as a moral failing, a lack of courage, or a mere psychological hurdle to be overcome by positive thinking. But fear is far more fundamental. It is the architect of our internal cage, the ultimate weapon of entropy against the human capacity for joy and action. If we wish to dismantle this cage, we cannot rely on self-help platitudes or shallow motivation. We need a radical formula, a philosophy powerful enough to transform the very nature of the emotion itself. We need Spinoza. Baruch Spinoza, the 17th century lens grinder turned radical metaphysician, viewed emotions not as sins or virtues, but as natural occurrences, like the laws governing the trajectory of a stone. His work, The Ethics, offers not a doctrine of morality, but a geometry of the passions. For Spinoza, fear is an entirely mechanistic phenomenon. It is not an evil spirit. It is merely an inadequate idea. Fear, he defines, is simply the idea of some future outcome which we doubt, combined with a feeling of pain, a reduction in our body's power of acting. When we are fearful, we are passive. We are being acted upon by the world rather than acting in accordance with our own nature. We suffer precisely because we do not understand the true causes of our suffering. This is Spinoza's radical diagnosis. Emotional pain is intellectual error. The traditional approach to fear tells us to fight the feeling, to use willpower to suppress the anxiety. Spinoza would dismiss this as futile. You cannot fight the shadow with moralizing. Willpower is often just another form of passive reaction. The only way to stop suffering under the weight of an emotion is to dissolve the ignorance that sustains it. The formula for emotional freedom is terrifyingly simple, yet incredibly difficult to execute. You must turn the inadequate idea into an adequate idea. You must replace imagination with intellect. Spinoza famously stated, "An emotion, which is a passion, ceases to be a passion as soon as we form a clear and distinct idea of it." Imagine the emotion of fear as a thick fog obscuring a winding road. As long as the fog persists, every sound is magnified, every corner seems perilous, and you slow to a crawl. You are controlled by the potential dangers you cannot see. But what happens when you introduce the light of understanding? You begin to map the road. You analyze the fog. It is merely condensed water vapor driven by a specific air temperature, interacting with predictable thermal currents. When you understand the necessary and sufficient causes for the fog's existence, the sensation of fear associated with it begins to lift. The road remains winding, the challenge remains present, but the panic dissolves. We stop fearing the future when we understand that the future is simply the necessary consequence of the present and the past. When we perceive ourselves as an inseparable part of the immutable, eternal order of nature, the great system Spinoza called God or nature, our personal anxieties shrink. We are no longer tossed about by random misfortune because we realize there is no such thing as random misfortune. There is only necessity. This is not a surrender to fate, but the highest form of acceptance, which immediately elevates our power to act. When we transform the blind, fearful passion into clear, distinct knowledge, the painful emotion transforms into something glorious, fortitude, contentment, and intellectual joy. To stop living in fear is to stop being a slave to external accidents. It is to choose illumination over paralysis, to choose the active life over the passive one. The cage is not built by what the world does to you. It is built by the shadows you cast when you refuse to understand why the world acts as it must. Open the mind, shine the light of adequate understanding, and watch the shadows and the fear they sustain recede. Freedom is not the absence of trouble. It is the absolute mastery of your reaction to necessity. This is the radical liberation offered by the great philosopher of clarity. Superstition as the architecture of fear. We live under skies heavy with uncertainty, constantly searching for meaning in the noise. But the greatest burden we carry is not uncertainty itself, but the architecture we build to manage it. Superstition. Superstition is never merely harmless ritual. It is the language of fear, translated into rigid practice and enforced dogma. It creates walls where there should be open space. And historically, the powerful, rulers, priests, those who desire the totalization of control, understood this mechanism intimately. They didn't just tolerate superstition, they actively cultivated it, weaponizing the people's terror of the unknown as a lever for compliance. Superstition in this light is the political economy of anxiety. It ensures the masses remain perpetually passive, trapped in an unending cycle of false hope and inevitable despair over forces they are told they cannot possibly understand, only placate. Into this fog of manufactured apprehension stepped a man who lived outside the walls, Baruch Spinoza. A humble lens grinder, excommunicated by his own community, living a quiet life that produced the loudest intellectual detonation in European history. Spinoza saw superstition not as a simple theological error, but as a systematic flaw in the human operating system. He knew that the only way to truly tear down the architecture of fear was not through political revolution, but through an internal, radical shift in understanding. He proposed a formula for emotional freedom so complete, so demanding, that it remains terrifying to the institutions that profit from our confusion. Spinoza's radical declaration begins simply: fear is fundamentally a passive emotion. It is a state of suffering where the mind possesses inadequate, confused knowledge of the causes of its affliction. When we fear the storm, we are afraid of its potential effect on us, but we do not grasp the intricate, necessary chain of causality that brought the storm into being. This inadequacy, this void of understanding, allows the mind to generate fantasies, demons, gods, curses, lucky charms. These fantasies are the immediate building blocks of superstition. They are the scaffolding built over the gaping holes of our ignorance. To stop living in fear, Spinoza demands we stop being passive recipients of the world's effects. We must become active agents through the relentless pursuit of adequate knowledge. The Spinozist breakthrough is this: we suffer when we are acted upon. We are free when we act. When a person believes their life is determined by fickle, angry deities or chaotic chance, they are enslaved. They are perpetually cycling between hope, the unstable joy born of an image of a future we desire but doubt, and fear, the unstable sadness born of an image of a future we dread but believe may happen. The two are inseparable chains, forged by the same inadequacy of understanding. The radical formula for emotional freedom, therefore, is identical to the pursuit of philosophical truth. Freedom is not found in escaping causality, but in recognizing that everything that happens, the good, the terrible, the uncertain, happens through necessity. When we understand a passion, when we trace its cause back through the infinite chain of nature, that passion ceases to be a suffering. The fear of death, for instance, is terrifying only when death appears as an arbitrary event interrupting a beloved life. When understood as a necessary consequence of the infinite structure of nature, the emotion transforms. When we achieve what Spinoza calls the third kind of knowledge, intuition, the ability to see things under the aspect of eternity, fear dissolves. It is replaced not by indifference but by the intellectual love of God, which is nothing more than the serene, active recognition of necessity itself. This love is the highest possible state of the mind, a joy that cannot be corrupted by fortune or accident, because it is rooted in the comprehension of fortune and accident. It is the joy of being a knowing part of the whole. The architecture of fear is built on ignorance. The blueprint for freedom is understanding. Spinoza offers us a powerful, uncompromising exchange. Surrender the comfort of hope and the pain of fear, and in return, claim the unshakable sovereignty of reason. Stop praying for the dice to roll differently. Start understanding why the table is tilted. That is the architecture of true freedom. How hope feeds fear. We speak constantly about the importance of hope. It is the necessary fuel for resistance, the flickering light in the darkest passage. When fear grips us, we are told to hold fast to hope. But what if this conventional wisdom is fundamentally flawed? What if the very act of hoping creates the space for the deepest fear to grow? What if, in a profoundly unsettling inversion, hope is not the opposite of fear, but merely its shadow twin? This is the radical claim Baruch Spinoza makes when he sets out his formula for emotional freedom. To Spinoza, the emotional life of most people is a state of perpetual bondage, a life lived in fear even when they believe they are living in joy. He saw hope and fear not as separate entities but as inseparable twins, both born of the exact same weakness: inadequate knowledge of the future. Hope, he wrote, is simply unstable joy arising from the image of a doubtful thing, and fear, unstable sadness arising from the same doubt. The vital word in both definitions is doubtful. Both emotions are conditional. Both are built on the sand of contingency, the uncertain gap between the present and what might yet be. They are volatile because they require us to predict and rely upon external events that lie outside the scope of our power. This conditionality is the engine of human anxiety. If your joy, your hope, is dependent on something outside of your control coming to fruition, then your sadness, your fear, is equally guaranteed if that external thing fails to materialize. Hope is an investment in volatility. The person who hopes desperately for the approval of a superior invests equally in the fear of their rejection. The person who hopes for endless financial security simultaneously accepts the terrifying possibility of utter ruin. In this state, we become prisoners, dragged along by what Spinoza calls passive effects, the passions. We are enslaved because our internal state is perpetually dictated by the ebb and flow of external circumstances we cannot guarantee. They tell us that we are incomplete, insufficient, until the external world aligns perfectly with our desires. And as long as we live under the tyranny of the doubtful, we are perpetually cycling between the instability of hoping and the instability of fearing. Spinoza's formula for liberation is breathtakingly simple, yet demands a complete re-engineering of the self. His freedom is not found in the rejection of emotion, but in the transformation of passive passion into active action. The only way to cease fearing the future is to cease hoping for the future. We must replace the unstable, imagined image of the good with the stable, certain understanding of reality. This is the moment we move from being acted upon to acting. We exchange the tyranny of chance for the foundation of necessity understood. To achieve this, we must dismantle external dependency. We must turn our gaze inward and focus our intellectual effort on understanding the necessary, immutable chain of cause and effect, the knowledge of why things are. When we recognize that all things proceed from necessity, governed by natural laws, we realize that the object of our desperate hope or paralyzing fear was never truly contingent. It was simply misunderstood. The shift is seismic. We stop dwelling in the emotional chaos of potential outcomes and begin dwelling in the intellectual clarity of present causes. When we fully grasp the chain of reason, when we see ourselves not as fragile, floating entities subject to luck, but as necessary parts of an infinite system, the ground shifts beneath our feet. This clarity, this adequate idea, is Spinoza's definition of virtue and power. It is an internal power that cannot be threatened by external failures. We are no longer striving for a doubtful future good, but are actively realizing a present internal good, which is the sheer power of understanding. This is where the passions, hope and fear, lose their grip. They are based on darkness and doubt, and they cannot survive the light of genuine knowledge. This is the radical formula. Emotional freedom is not the achievement of desires, but the clarity of understanding. You stop living in the contingent possibility of future disaster and begin living in the certain power of present reality. We replace the instability of hoping and fearing with the quiet, unshakable foundation of wisdom. And in that shift, the cycle breaks, leaving only the quiet exhilaration of freedom. The thinking body, where fear resides. We speak often of freedom, but what is freedom if we are perpetually shackled by the specter of what might happen? Fear is the most efficient warden humanity has ever devised, a perpetual whisper in the dark that tells us we are weak, vulnerable, and ultimately alone. It collapses the potential of the future into a single, concrete threat, paralyzing the present moment before it has a chance to flourish. We are governed by shadows. For Baruch Spinoza, this constant state of apprehension is the ultimate offense against existence. His philosophy begins with a single, undeniable premise. Every living thing, by its very nature, endeavors to persist in its own being. He called this fundamental drive the Conatus. This is not a choice. It is the irresistible engine of life itself. To be alive is to strive, to affirm, to increase our power to act. If striving is our nature, then fear is the precise mechanism by which that nature is sabotaged. Fear, for Spinoza, is not an active power within us. It is a passive affection, an emotion where the mind passes to a lesser state of perfection. It is always a reaction, a suffering, something done to us by an external cause. It is the sudden shock of imagining a future hurt, a diminished being. When we are afraid, our power to act is lessened. We are ruled by external causes that we do not fully understand. We are thinking the thought of our own destruction, and in doing so, we are participating in it. Fear is confusion, mistaken for foresight. The world teaches us that controlling fear means resisting it, fighting it, or attempting to avoid the things that make us anxious. We are told to use willpower, but Spinoza recognized the profound futility of this approach. An emotion cannot be overcome by an act of will alone, any more than we can stop a tidal wave by simply wishing it away. Willpower is merely another passion, another emotion, applied to the original problem. We become trapped in a self-devouring cycle of resistance, spending our energy fighting the symptom, never the root cause. We become warriors against our own bodies. Spinoza's genius lies in his radical formula for emotional freedom. We achieve mastery over our emotions not by abolishing them, but by understanding them. We cannot escape the chain of cause and effect, but we can change our relationship to it. Since the body is the mind's object, and the mind is simply the idea of the body, true freedom requires knowing exactly what causes us to act and what causes us to suffer. This knowledge transforms the passive affection, the suffering, into an active one, the understanding. When we perceive the external cause for our fear, say, the inevitability of change, the loss of security, or the ultimate fact of death, and we understand that cause fully, rationally, as an eternal and necessary part of the total structure of existence, the emotion changes its character. It ceases to be blind terror, which diminishes our being, and becomes understanding, which enlarges it. We do not stop fearing the unknown by hiding from it. We stop fearing the unknown by making it known. The fear of death, for instance, is fundamentally the fear of ceasing to strive. But the person who lives according to reason, who actively understands the necessity of their place in the vast, infinite reality, ceases to dwell on what they might lose. They dwell on what they actively possess, the power of thought itself, the joy of the Conatus, fully expressed. Emotional freedom is not the cessation of feeling. It is the realization that we are part of something immense, necessary, and rational. Fear demands that we shrink. Understanding demands that we expand. To stop living in fear is to realize that the body and the mind are not opponents but reflections, and that true freedom is achieved when the thinking body finally understands the necessity of its own magnificent, terrifying, and completely free existence. We move from being acted upon to acting. We exchange our panic for persistence. Sad passions, prisons of the mind. We talk often of freedom, but rarely do we acknowledge the architect of our deepest confinement. The prison we inhabit is not built of steel or stone. It is forged entirely from sad passions: fear, regret, envy, uncertainty. These are the mental bars that diminish our light and choke our ability to act. This is the condition Baruch Spinoza called human bondage. For much of history, philosophy treated human emotion as a moral battlefield. We were told to fight our passions, to suppress the animal within, or to appeal to a divine judgment for reprieve. Spinoza, the quiet lens grinder of Amsterdam, saw this struggle for what it truly was: a profound misunderstanding of physics. His revolutionary insight, laid bare in the Ethics, is simple and terrifyingly profound. Emotions are not sins, they are mechanisms. They follow the same rigorous, unavoidable laws as gravity or the movement of the planets. When we suffer from sadness or when we are crippled by fear, we are suffering because we are treating ourselves as an empire within an empire, believing we are exceptions to the chain of cause and effect that governs all of nature. We live in fear because we imagine contingency. We believe the future is arbitrary, waiting to strike without reason, that disaster lurks just outside the border of our control. But for Spinoza, there is no true contingency. Everything that happens must happen. To know this is not an invitation to resignation. It is the radical formula for emotional freedom. The prison bars weaken the moment we realize they are constructed entirely from misperception. A passion is nothing more than a mental confusion, a hazy, inadequate idea of a cause. Freedom, in the Spinoza sense, is intellectual clarity. It is the moment we identify the precise, necessary cause of the emotion we are feeling. If we suffer passively, it is because we are acted upon by external forces we do not understand. We are tossed about by the wind of circumstance. But when we understand the precise causal sequence that produced the emotion within us, when we grasp that the external event, should it occur, is merely a necessary consequence of the infinite structure of reality, the passion loses its tyrannical power. It transforms from a chain of suffering into an object of pure contemplation. We stop being defined by the effect because we have embraced the necessity of the cause. Spinoza called this fundamental striving to persist and increase our own power. Conatus. Sad passions, fear, grief, pity, are defined precisely by how they decrease our conatus. They literally make us less powerful, less active, less perfect. Joyful passions, born of clear knowledge and true understanding, are the corresponding increase of that power. The practical mandate is therefore crystal clear. Stop investing energy in the beliefs, relationships, and self-conceptions that diminish your capacity to act. Stop entertaining hazy ideas about guilt, misfortune, or external threat. Instead, pursue the knowledge, the clear, distinct understanding of nature and your place within it, that necessarily increases your ability to flourish. The path to freedom is not through fighting the passions, but through incorporating them into the fabric of the intellect. When an emotion is understood in its totality, its necessity, its place in the infinite order, it ceases to be a passive suffering. It becomes an active affirmation, an insight into the structure of reality itself. This is the profound, liberating irony of Spinoza's system. True emotional freedom is not the absence of chains, but the absolute intellectual acceptance of the necessity of the universe. When we understand the chain of necessity, when we see the perfection in the causal structure that holds everything, including our deepest suffering, in place, we achieve the highest state possible, the intellectual love of nature. And in that final, clear-eyed acceptance, the prisons of the mind dissolve. We cease to be slaves to what we do not understand, and we begin to live, truly and actively, in the radiant certainty of what is. Subscribe. Knowledge is the only freedom. We spend our lives seeking autonomy, yet often feel we are merely prisoners of circumstance, shackled by anxiety, driven by resentments we can barely name. We believe we are masters of our choices, but in the deepest quiet, we recognize the puppeteer. Fear. We live in continuous dread of potential failure, public judgment, illness, or loss. This dread is not merely an inconvenience. It is the fundamental state of human unfreedom. We are bound by things we cannot see and fates we cannot control. For Baruch Spinoza, this daily struggle against invisible chains was not merely a psychological defect, but a fundamental misunderstanding of existence itself. He offered a radical formula for emotional freedom, one that demanded we stop living in fear by first stopping the fight against reality. Spinoza understood that the great tragedy of the human condition is not suffering but ignorance. We believe we are acting, but we are primarily reacting. When our state of mind is dictated by external events, a raise, an insult, a tragedy, we are not the cause of our own experience. He calls the raw, uncontrolled emotion a passion. A passion is a confused idea. It is the state where we are acted upon by external forces, where the origin of our sadness or joy lies outside of ourselves. When we hate, when we dread, when we are consumed by jealousy, we are not free, we are slaves. We are defined by what the world does to us, rather than what we understand ourselves to be. This is the great bondage, the condition of passivity. The only exit from this servitude, Spinoza insists, is rigorous understanding. Fear and despair, anger and attachment, these are merely the symptoms of inadequate knowledge. They are shadows cast by the things we fail to comprehend. We struggle because we perceive reality through the fractured lens of our personal, temporary desires. We see the world as serving us, and when it fails to comply, we suffer. We demand exceptions to the laws of nature. We plead for the universe to be fairer, softer, and more accommodating to our individual will. Spinoza's genius lies in his refusal to treat the universe as something personal. His cosmos, often labeled God or nature, is a vast, interconnected, deterministic system operating solely by necessary laws. Nothing happens by accident. Everything that is precisely what must be. If we could truly comprehend this necessity, if we could move beyond seeing events as insults or blessings, and see them instead as inevitable consequences of an infinite chain of cause and effect, what would happen to our personal grief? The radical formula is this: an emotion, which is suffering when it is merely something we undergo, becomes a pure action once we fully grasp its cause. When we turn the emotional confusion of fear or sorrow into an adequate idea, when we see the external event not as an arbitrary misfortune but as a necessary and essential component of a whole we are already a part of, the destructive power of the passion dissolves. The loss that crushed us yesterday, the betrayal that poisoned our sleep, when viewed under the aspect of eternity, as Spinoza put it, they cease to be personalized attacks and become simply necessary moments within the entire fabric of nature. We do not cease to feel, but the sting of servitude is removed. We move from the passive suffering of "why me" to the active, clear understanding of "this is how the world works, and I understand it." This knowledge is the true measure of our power. The more our ideas are adequate, the more we are active. The more we are active, the more we are free. Freedom, according to Spinoza, is not the illusion of infinite choice. Freedom is the profound, joyful alignment with necessity. We are not victims of fate. We are consciousnesses capable of understanding the entire mechanism. To understand the necessity of a thing is to cease fearing it. Knowledge, therefore, is not just a tool for navigation. It is the definitive act of liberation. It is the only true means to abolish fear, and in that abolition, we find Spinoza's ultimate goal, the intellectual love of God, which is nothing less than the pure, active joy of being fully alive and fully known to ourselves. To know the world is to stop being afraid of it. That is the radical formula. The passage from the first to the second kind of knowledge. We all know the feeling, the tightening in the chest, the invisible chain that binds us to anxieties we cannot name. We are slaves not to a master with a whip, but to shadows projected onto the wall of our own minds. This is the condition Spinoza describes as human bondage. We mistake the effects of things for the things themselves. We live in the world of the first kind of knowledge, the realm of imagination, rumor, and sensory accident. This is the place where genuine clarity vanishes, and where fear takes root, nourished by inadequate ideas. Fear and its anxious twin, hope. They are not opposites, but accomplices, holding the door open to the prison cell. They are passive affects, emotions that happen to us, rather than being generated by us. To live here is to believe that the world is chaos, that events are personal attacks, and that your happiness is entirely dependent on things outside your command. We are constantly surprised, constantly hurt, because we never stop demanding that reality conform to our personal, transient wishes. Spinoza calls these emotions, these passions born of ignorance, our inadequacy. They represent the extent to which the mind fails to grasp its own cause and the cause of its suffering. But Spinoza offers a radical escape plan. It is not found in mysticism or denial, but in the cold, clear light of understanding. The passage from bondage to freedom begins with a single profound shift, the movement from inadequate ideas to adequate ideas. We stop imagining and start reasoning. This is the transition to the second kind of knowledge. How do we cross this seemingly insurmountable chasm? By confronting necessity. Necessity is the fundamental architecture of existence. Spinoza's universe is not governed by a whimsical deity who might change its mind, leaving you suddenly stranded. It is governed by nature's immutable, eternal, and non-negotiable laws. When we truly grasp this, when we see that every event, every circumstance, every joy, and every sorrow is simply a necessary outcome of infinite causality, the grip of passive emotion loosens. Fear thrives on the possibility that things might be otherwise. If I hope for an outcome, I necessarily fear its opposite. If I believe a calamity could have been avoided, I am trapped in regret. But if events cannot be otherwise, if they must be exactly as they are, what remains of fear? It dissolves into the logical geometry of existence. This is the radical pivot, understanding necessity. This intellectual realization does not lead to cold resignation. It leads to unparalleled emotional power. The second kind of knowledge transforms our passions into actions. When we understand the necessary cause of a painful event, that understanding itself stops being a passive suffering and becomes an active mental engagement, a genuine, adequate thought. The feeling that replaces fear is acquiescence, a rational tranquility that is the bedrock of virtue. Virtue for Spinoza is not moral obedience. It is simply the active striving to persevere in our own being, guided entirely by reason. This striving leads directly to the highest human emotion, joy. Not the fleeting, contingent joy of temporary success, but a robust, enduring satisfaction rooted in self-knowledge and the intellectual love of nature, the Amor Intellectualis Dei. This is the moment the mind sees itself as a necessary part of the whole and realizes that its true power lies in understanding that totality. Emotional freedom is simply the mind's ability to affect external reality less and to understand external reality more. The formula is terrifyingly simple. Stop wishing the world were different. Stop seeking impossible control over external forces. Instead, seek understanding of the necessity of those forces. Fear is the direct cost of inadequate knowledge. Emotional freedom is the lasting dividend of adequate knowledge. Spinoza asks us to trade the chaos of imagination for the perfect, ordered symmetry of reason. We are not designed to live in constant dread. We are designed for freedom. The passage is open. All that is required is the courage to look at the world and at ourselves with absolute, unwavering clarity. Viewing the world under the aspect of eternity, Specie Aeternitatis. We spend our lives tethered, not to walls, but to the future we dread and the past we regret. We are prisoners of time itself, suffering not from events, but from our interpretation of their temporary personal impact. This is the great emotional trap. We judge our existence moment by moment, defining our happiness by what we possess right now, or what we fear we might lose tomorrow. We are slaves to fortune because we believe fortune is capricious, targeting us specifically. We live in a perpetual state of fear, not of nature, but of the imagined cruelty of a chaotic universe. But what if the source of your deepest anxiety, the perceived randomness, the unbearable cruelty of chance, was merely an illusion born of limited vision? Baruch Spinoza, the radical Dutch philosopher, offers a terrifying yet profoundly liberating answer. He demands a radical shift, to stop viewing the world through the keyhole of our own fleeting existence, and instead to view it Specie Aeternitatis, under the aspect of eternity. This is not a mystical concept, it is a discipline of the mind. Spinoza defines the universe, God, nature, substance, as a unified, infinite, self-caused system. There is nothing outside of it. And critically, everything that happens within the system happens by absolute necessity. Nothing is contingent, nothing is random. If you can grasp this intellectual truth, that your entire life, every triumph and every trauma, is necessitated by the perfect, unbreakable laws of nature, the emotional landscape shifts entirely. Fear is nothing more than the imagination of a future evil which we see as contingent or avoidable. Regret is the grief we feel over a past event we wish had been otherwise. But if the event could not, by definition, have been otherwise, if it was a necessary link in an infinite chain, then the emotional ground for fear and regret collapses. To view your current pain, your financial ruin, the loss of someone loved, or even your own impending death, Specie Aeternitatis, is to remove the personalized horror from the event. You are not seeing it as a misfortune that happened to you, but as an eternal truth about the structure of reality. We suffer when we see our life as a series of isolated frames cut off from the infinite film reel. The heartbreak of the moment appears absolute. But the moment we intellectually connect that isolated frame back into the whole, seeing its necessity, its perfection within the context of the eternal, the pain shifts from a personal wound to an objective reality. This is the Spinozist definition of emotional freedom. It is not freedom from suffering, but freedom in understanding. The individual who achieves this perspective no longer fears death, because death is understood not as an interruption, but as the necessary modification of a mode of substance. They stop fearing contingency, because they know contingency does not exist. They stop seeking personal salvation, realizing that salvation lies in the acceptance of the eternal perfect order. This intellectual acceptance is what Spinoza called the third kind of knowledge, the intellectual love of God, or nature. It is the highest form of human contentment. The man who lives Specie Aeternitatis is not happy because he has avoided suffering. He is free because he has understood it. He is no longer driven by passive emotions, the fear of what might happen, but by the active, profound joy that comes from recognizing his own necessary, integrated place within the boundless, unyielding, and perfect system of existence. Stop living in fear of chance. Start living in the sublime clarity of necessity. That clarity is the true canvas of thought. the virtue of understanding, not judging. We find ourselves so often trapped by our own definitions of good and evil, success and failure. These categories, they feel ancient, foundational, yet they are often nothing more than brittle cages we build around our fleeting emotions. Imagine for a moment a philosopher who sought to tear those cages down, not through moral rebellion, but through rigorous mathematics. Benedictus de Spinoza. To understand Spinoza is to understand the greatest, most radical challenge to our emotional life, that everything that happens, happens necessarily, and that our anguish comes not from the event itself, but from our misunderstanding of its cause. Most people, most of the time, are driven by two forces, hope and fear. We structure our lives around hoping for pleasure and fearing pain. But Spinoza saw this reliance on hope and fear as intellectual servitude. When you hope, you are already accepting the possibility of failure. You are outsourcing your contentment to the whims of fortune. Spinoza's great insight, the core of his ethics, is devastatingly simple. Nature does not operate according to human morality. The sun does not rise because it is good to be warm. The drought does not occur because the people are sinful. Things simply are. Everything in the universe, including our own actions, is the result of an infinite chain of prior causes, flowing inexorably from the nature of God, which Spinoza defined not as a moral judge, but as nature itself, or substance. If everything is necessary, then nothing can be different. And if nothing can be different, then the very act of moral judgment, of saying something ought to have been otherwise, is the profoundest act of intellectual error. It is resisting reality itself. This is the doorway to understanding and the end of judgment. When we look at a person we despise, or an event we deem catastrophic, our first reaction is often to assign blame. That judgment brings with it a storm of passive emotions, anger, regret, sorrow. Spinoza called these passive emotions passions. Because we suffer them, they happen to us. They diminish our power to act and think clearly. But what if we could replace judgment with understanding? What if instead of asking, why did they do that, implying they had a free, arbitrary choice to behave better, we asked, what set of causes, internal and external, necessarily produce this specific effect? This shift is not forgiveness in the Christian sense, but liberation in the philosophical sense. When we understand the necessity of the cause, the anger dissipates. We realize that the person acting badly is not acting out of some incomprehensible evil, but is simply determined by their present state, their inadequate ideas, their limited power, their chain of conditioning. We are not judging an evil act. We are observing a deficiency. Much like a physician observes a physical illness, we don't judge the fever, we seek to understand its cause. The true virtue, the Spinozistic path to joy, is the transition from passive suffering to active understanding. He called this intellectual love of God, or the highest form of reason. It is the joy that arises not when we achieve a desired outcome, but when we clearly understand the nature of reality. When you stop living in fear of future consequences and stop regretting past actions because you understand them all as necessary expressions of substance, you become truly free. You move from the realm of turbulent passions to the serene domain of active emotions. Emotional freedom is not the absence of feeling, but the control of feeling through clear, unwavering sight. The sage, according to Spinoza, does not wait for fortune to smile. The sage understands fortune itself. They are not moved by fear because they have replaced the dark uncertainty of the future with the illuminating certainty of necessary cause. This is the radical formula. Know the necessity of the world, and you will not only stop judging others, but you will stop judging yourself. And in that stillness, you finally begin to live. Transforming passive emotion into active affect. We often speak of emotions as things that happen to us. A sudden wave of sadness, an unanticipated surge of fear, a jealousy that claws its way up our throat. We feel possessed, driven, reactive. This is the baseline of human suffering, the experience of being acted upon by the world, a prisoner in the theater of our own minds, watching external events unfold that dictate our internal state. But what if this feeling of being controlled is, fundamentally, a misunderstanding? What if the path to true emotional freedom is not through suppression, but through radical self-ownership? This is the radical core of Spinoza's philosophy. He didn't just observe emotions, he categorized them, dissected them, and offered a terrifying yet liberating formula for exiting the passive life. We are, Spinoza insists, beings defined by Conatus, our inherent essential striving to persist in our own being. Everything we do, think, and feel is an attempt to increase or maintain our power to act. When an emotion is passive, a passio, it means our power to act has been diminished or increased by something external. A market crash, a compliment from a stranger, a sudden downpour. We are reliant on the outside world for our inner equilibrium. And of all the passive emotions, none is more debilitating than sadness, or its close cousin, fear. Sadness for Spinoza is not just a bad mood, it is the physical and spiritual definition of a decrease in our power, a contraction of the soul. Fear is the anticipation of that decrease. To live in fear is to live in a constant state of self-diminishment. It is to voluntarily hand the keys of our striving to external forces, the weather, politics, other people's opinions. But Spinoza recognized that we are not doomed to this passive existence. The key to transformation is understanding. The passive emotion is born of inadequate knowledge. We fear what we do not fully comprehend. We are sad about events whose true, necessary causes remain opaque to us. His formula is elegant and brutal. We stop being controlled by an emotion the moment we form a clear and distinct idea of it. The moment we recognize the external cause, and more crucially, the internal mechanism through which it affects us, that emotion ceases to be a passion and begins to transform into an action. It is the difference between saying, "I am afraid," and saying, "I understand that this uncertain outcome generates a sensation of fear in me because my Conatus is threatened by a lack of clarity regarding future resources." The act of analysis is the act of transfer. When we actively engage our intellect to understand the necessity of an event, even a painful one, we draw the emotional cause inside. We move the locus of control from the outside world to our own capacity for reason. This is the birth of active affect. Emotions generated internally, derived solely from our own understanding. The highest form of active affect is intellectual love of God, which, stripped of its theological language, is simply the perfect, serene joy that comes from understanding the universe and our necessary place within it. This joy is impervious to external events because it is sourced internally. If passive joy is like sunlight hitting a mirror, fleeting and dependent on the external source, active joy is like the fire itself, constant and self-sustaining. The freedom Spinoza offers is not the freedom from pain, but the freedom to act in spite of it. It is the radical realization that we can choose to live not as puppets jerked by the strings of external circumstance, but as conscious authors of our own internal experience. Stop living in fear. Start living in understanding. For the moment you comprehend your chains, they dissolve into pure light. The transformation from passive suffering to active striving is the ultimate human imperative. We possess the power to be causes, not effects. We need only choose to exercise our reason. The power of reason against the fear of the future. We spend our lives waiting for something terrible to happen, not just planning for the future, but anticipating its worst possible iteration. It is the fear of the unknown that truly owns us. We can manage a known threat, a looming deadline, a specific illness, but the future, unbounded and infinite in its possibilities, holds us captive in the dungeon of what if. The human mind, so adept at mapping the immediate environment, proves catastrophically inept when trying to chart the void of tomorrow. This anxiety is perhaps the oldest shackle known to consciousness. We mistake prediction for protection, and in doing so, we sacrifice the only time we actually possess, the present. Baruch Spinoza, the great lens grinder of Amsterdam, saw this paralysis clearly. He understood that this pervasive fear is not a noble warning system. It is merely an inadequate idea. To Spinoza, our deepest anxieties, our paralyzing worries, are passive effects. They are emotions that hold us hostage because we do not understand their cause. When we fear the future, we are terrified not by the future itself, but by our own ignorance of the chain of events that will inevitably lead to it. We assign malice to chance, when in reality, chance is simply necessity misunderstood. The fear of loss, the fear of change, these things cripple our power to act now because we are focused entirely on outcomes that lie outside our sphere of influence. We are perpetually waiting for the thunder instead of building the roof. Spinoza offers a profoundly radical solution, one that seems counterintuitive at first blush. True freedom is found in the acceptance of absolute necessity. Everything that happens, happens because it must. Not because some deity willed it arbitrarily, but because it is the logical, necessary conclusion of an infinite chain of prior causes stretching back to the beginning of time itself. This is not bleak fatalism. Fatalism resigns itself to the worst outcome while still suffering from the anxiety of waiting. Spinoza's necessity is an invitation to profound understanding. When we comprehend that events are not contingent but necessary, that the world simply is, the energy we once spent fighting the inevitable is instantly freed. We stop screaming at the tide. We start studying the ocean. Reason is the instrument that performs this alchemy. When a passive emotion, like the fear of bankruptcy or the anxiety over a loved one's health, arises, Spinoza instructs us not to suppress it, but to subject it to the ruthless clarity of intellect. We ask, what is the true cause of this fear? What part of this situation is genuinely within my control, and what part belongs purely to the external chain of necessity? By tracing the cause of our suffering, the emotion ceases to be a suffering. It transforms. The passive affect becomes an active understanding. We move from being effects tossed by the winds of fortune to being active agents who understand our own nature and our specific place within the totality of nature. This is the critical difference between being a slave to emotion and becoming the master of one's own inner world. Emotional freedom is not about predicting the future successfully. It is about dissolving the need to predict the future at all. It is about recognizing that every moment is perfectly necessary and therefore perfect in its design. This transformation culminates in what Spinoza called Amor Intellectualis Dei, the intellectual love of God, or more simply, the intellectual love of reality. It is the highest possible state of mind. It is not loving things because they are good for us, but loving things simply because they are. When we see the vast, interconnected order of nature and realize that our own life, our own struggles, our own temporary suffering are all necessary parts of that magnificent unified whole, the fear dissolves, and the anxiety that relies on randomness and contingency simply cannot survive the light of absolute order. Emotional freedom is therefore not achieved by wishing the future were different, but by rigorously understanding why the future must be exactly what it is. To understand the necessity of tomorrow is to liberate the joy of today. Stop asking the universe to change its mind. Start using your own. We find peace not by grasping at an idealized outcome, but by resting securely in the knowledge that reality, in its entirety, is flawless, necessary, and ultimately deserving of our highest intellectual love. The intellectual love of God, supreme serenity. We live constantly tethered to tomorrow, defined not by what we possess, but by what we might lose. This anxiety, this dull, throbbing dread that governs our decisions, is often masked as prudence or responsibility, but Spinoza saw it for what it truly was, slavery. To the Dutch philosopher Baruch Spinoza, the fundamental human tragedy is emotional bondage. We imagine ourselves free agents in a world that is fundamentally arbitrary, leading to inevitable suffering when that world refuses to bend to our will. We are tossed about by external forces, by fortune, by the fickle opinions of others, or by the sheer terror of the unknown. Fear, Spinoza teaches, is simply an inadequate idea of the future compounded by pain. Hope, its supposed antidote, is merely fear's unstable twin, a joy born from an uncertain outcome. Both are evidence of our passive state, proof that we are letting things outside of us determine our inner reality. As long as we are subject to these passions, we are not citizens of the universe. We are merely victims of coincidence. But Spinoza offers a radical, almost terrifying liberation. He demands we stop living in fear by abandoning the notion of a universe built on judgment, caprice, or reward. The universe, God, nature, Deus sive natura, is not a personage who grants miracles or exacts vengeance. It is the infinite unified substance governed by immutable laws. Everything that happens out of absolute logical necessity. There are no accidents, only things whose causes we have yet to understand. This realization is the key to emotional freedom. When we understand necessity, when we adequately grasp that our sorrow, our joy, our very existence is a necessary mode in the infinite chain of cause and effect, the power of those external forces dissolves. We are freed not by controlling the world, but by understanding that the world cannot be other than it is. The passions that once enslaved us, anger, envy, even overwhelming grief, become mere objects of contemplation. We cease to be the subject experiencing the pain and become, instead, the scientist observing the effect. We analyze the emotion, tracing its cause, recognizing its inevitable place in the cosmic order. This is the transition from passive suffering to active knowledge. And this active knowledge culminates in what Spinoza calls the highest achievement of the human spirit, Amor Intellectualis Dei, the intellectual love of God. This love is not devotional, nor is it based on the fear of punishment or the hope of eternal reward. It is a purely cognitive joy. It is the sublime recognition that the intellect, which understands the universe, is itself a part of the infinite intellect of God. To love God intellectually is simply to understand, with profound clarity and joy, the eternal, necessary order of nature. This understanding is the supreme serenity. When we realize that our own striving for existence is merely nature's power expressing itself through us, we attain a psychological state impervious to fortune. We no longer crave control over things that are inherently uncontrollable. We cease to fear death because we recognize that the mind, in its pure essence of knowledge, partakes in something eternal and necessary. The person who achieves this intellectual love is the one who is truly free. Their virtue is not a means to an end, it is its own reward. Their life is not defined by avoidance of evil, but by active engagement with knowledge. They are calm, not because the world has become gentler, but because they have achieved a place of certainty within the chaos. They have replaced the tyranny of fear and hope with the calm, unwavering majesty of understanding. To stop living in fear is to stop demanding that the universe negotiate with you. It is to assent completely to the reality of things, and in that radical acceptance find profound, lasting peace. Death is not an event in life. The great shadow that stretches across the map of human existence is not war, poverty, or disease. It is the inescapable, looming certainty of the end. We spend our lives either trying to forget it or actively preparing for it, and in doing so, we surrender the present moment to a future ghost. The fear of death is the ultimate engine of human paralysis. But what if the very concept we have of death is fundamentally wrong? What if the terror we feel is based on a profound miscategorization? Imagine a philosophy so radical, so profoundly unconcerned with the rewards of the afterlife, that it instantly neutralizes this primary fear. Baruch Spinoza, the lens grinder of Amsterdam, offered us a geometry for the soul that abolishes the terror of the void, not by promising salvation, but by redefining what life itself is. Spinoza's genius lay in his relentless consistency. If we approach the universe or God or nature, the substance of all things, through cold, hard reason, the emotional landscape changes instantly. We fear death because we conceive of it inadequately. We treat it as an active experience, a moment where we will consciously feel pain, regret, or absolute non-being. We give it agency, transforming it into a malicious entity waiting just beyond the horizon of our awareness. Spinoza shows us that this deep anxiety is merely a passive affect. It is a state of mind where we are acted upon by external causes, specifically the terrifying projection of our own eventual dissolution. This state of being governed by reactive emotions, fear, hope, insecurity, Spinoza called bondage. This is intellectual slavery. The core of his formula is simple, yet devastatingly effective. Death is not an event in life. Death is not a chapter in the book of life. It is the abrupt closing of the cover. It is the end of the script, not a scene within it. If death is the total cessation of the mechanism of mind and body, then the conscious, experiencing self, the I, cannot be there to witness it, much less suffer it. The event of death is experienced only by the survivors. If this is true, what is left to fear? We are not afraid of what death is. We are afraid of the idea of death. We are afraid of the thought of the future loss of the present moment, and by dwelling on that loss, we surrender the present moment itself. The path to emotional freedom, to breaking this bondage, requires a profound shift in perspective. It requires understanding that the universe operates through absolute necessity. Everything that happens must happen. To resent this necessity, to rage against the eventual cessation of our being, is to struggle against the nature of reality itself, a guaranteed source of lifelong misery. Spinoza offers us the ultimate path to freedom, the transition from passive effects to active effects. We move from being determined by external forces, fear, superstition, and the terror of the unknown, to being determined by our internal capacity for reason and understanding. A free man is one who is guided by reason, whose mind is constantly contemplating life, not death. When we understand the fundamental necessity of our existence and its limits, our sorrow and our fear can transform into a form of active joy. Amor Intellectualis Dei, the intellectual love of necessity. We are no longer governed by the inevitable decay of the body, but by the eternal increase of the mind's power while it is still capable. This is not a philosophy of resignation. It is the definitive act of liberation. The moment you stop treating death as a future event you must survive, you realize the only thing you have to lose is the present, and the present is the only thing you truly possess. The choice is stark: to live out our years in the shadow of non-being, or to inhabit the brilliance of what is right now, governed only by our own reason and our own joyful understanding of the absolute nature of reality. Stop contemplating the end. Start amplifying the here. That is Spinoza's radical, life-altering formula for freedom. The freedom of no longer needing hope. We spend our lives oscillating between two poles: the anxious dread of what might go wrong, and the desperate, often prayerful wish that it might go right. Fear and hope. We treat hope as a necessary virtue, a vital engine for perseverance, a light in the darkness. But what if hope is not freedom, but merely the other side of the coin of fear? What if they are inseparable chains designed to keep us perpetually unsettled? Baruch Spinoza, the radical Dutch philosopher, saw them not as separate psychological states, but as two sides of the same deficiency: insufficient knowledge of the world. His diagnosis is clinical and devastating. Hope, he wrote, is an inconstant pleasure, arising from the image of a future or past thing of whose outcome we are in doubt. The key word is doubt. When we hope, we are inherently uncertain. We are outsourcing our present peace to a hypothetical future. We place our emotional stability on a timeline we do not control. This means hope is inherently passive. It is something that happens to us, rather than something we actively choose or construct. It is an acknowledgement that we do not fully understand the causal chain of nature, and so we must wait anxiously for the verdict. We are victims of prediction. Spinoza understood that these are the two master emotions used by political and religious authorities to control the masses. Fear of punishment ensures obedience. Hope for reward ensures compliance. Those who are ruled by hope and fear are inherently susceptible to external manipulation, always looking outward for salvation or condemnation. They are never truly free. Think of the relationship geometrically. Fear is the anticipation of pain. Hope is the anticipation of pleasure. Spinoza shows us that the moment we experience one intensely, we immediately open ourselves to the possibility of the other. If you hope desperately for success, the fear of failure grows equally large. They are codependent shadows. If we live in a state defined by hoping, we are simultaneously living in a state defined by fearing. We are living in a permanent state of waiting. We are suspended in a hammock of uncertainty, perpetually swinging between anticipated joy and anticipated catastrophe. This paralysis is the very opposite of freedom. Freedom, for Spinoza, is movement. It is action rooted in understanding. The path out of this emotional purgatory is not about suppression of feeling, but about elevation, a radical shift from being acted upon to acting purely. Spinoza's ethical formula demands that we stop perceiving reality through the lens of human desire and start perceiving it through the lens of necessity. This is his radical proposition, that everything that happens necessarily. It flows inevitably from the infinite nature of God, or substance, or nature, whatever term you prefer. The universe is not a series of random events that could have been otherwise. It is a perfect, deterministic causal chain. When we grasp this, the entire duality of hope and fear collapses. They cease to have power over us because their foundation, the illusion of arbitrary outcomes, dissolves. We no longer need to hope for a desired outcome because we dedicate ourselves entirely to understanding the outcome that is. We transition from passive effects, those emotions that bind us to things outside our power, to active effects, which are rooted in knowledge and internal strength. This is the intellectual love of God. It is the profound realization that the universe cannot be other than it is, and we, as finite modes of that infinite substance, are already perfectly integrated into that necessity. The highest form of freedom is not the ability to choose your destiny, but the profound realization of your inherent nature within the system of destiny. It is the cessation of the emotional tug of war. We are free, not because we have guaranteed a good future, but because the future, whether painful or joyful, is fully understood as part of the total order. To stop living in fear, we must stop living in hope. We must move beyond wishing, beyond anticipating, beyond waiting. We stand fully in the present, armed with understanding. This radical indifference to the future, an indifference born not of apathy but of absolute knowledge, is the definition of emotional invulnerability. It is the freedom of no longer needing hope. Becoming the cause of oneself, sui causa. We spend so much of our lives reacting. We believe we are free, yet we are constantly buffeted by the winds of fortune, the whims of others, the sting of loss. This reactive life is fundamentally defined by fear. Fear of judgment, fear of scarcity, fear of the unknown, and most paralyzing of all, fear of our own lack of control. We are chained not by external forces, but by our own inadequate understanding of them. We mistake dependence for destiny and accident for malice. Baruch Spinoza, the great rationalist of the Enlightenment, posed a profound question that cuts through centuries of ethical philosophy. Are you truly free, or are you merely a puppet, manipulated by causes outside your own nature? Spinoza rejected the traditional notion that freedom means having limitless choice, or being able to choose against the determined order of the universe. For Spinoza, freedom is not the absence of necessity, but the understanding of it. The ultimate goal of human existence, he argued, is not happiness earned by external graces, but power realized internally. Not power over others, but the power over the self to be independent of external determination. The supreme achievement is to become sui causa, the cause of oneself. To be self-caused is to live according to your own inner necessity, rather than passively reflecting the pressures exerted by the outside world. Spinoza teaches that our emotional suffering, our fear, our envy, our crippling anxiety, stems entirely from what he called inadequate ideas. When we perceive an event as happening to us, without understanding the necessary chain of causes that led to it, we are passive. We are experiencing a passion, a suffering. Think of anger. Anger is the pain of feeling that an external force has violated our integrity, combined with an inadequate idea of why that force was necessary or predictable. We feel terror when the world appears chaotic, arbitrary, or unjust, because our ignorance leads us to believe we are vulnerable effects of random causes. This is the definition of human bondage, allowing our joys and sorrows to be dictated entirely by things we do not understand and cannot adequately control. The world becomes a terrifying, unpredictable place, and the only possible response is fear. The escape from this bondage is not mystical, but purely intellectual and emotional. It is understanding. To move from inadequate ideas to adequate ideas is to move from being passive to being active. It is to shift from the state of being acted upon by circumstances to the state of acting with purpose derived from knowledge. The moment we truly grasp that everything in nature follows necessary, immutable laws, physical, emotional, and psychological, we stop cursing the universe for its indifference and begin to see the profound beauty of its order. Fear relies fundamentally on ignorance. If you understand the full cause of the perceived harm, the emotion is transformed. You no longer suffer the passion. You begin to act from reason. This intellectual realization of necessity is the beginning of true freedom. When you are the adequate cause of your thoughts, your feelings, and your actions, you are no longer defined by external fortune. You become self-determining. This is Spinoza's radical formula for emotional freedom. Stop waiting for the world to conform to your desires. Stop reacting in ignorance and fear. Start understanding the necessity of things, including your own deepest nature. When we become the adequate cause of our own existence, when we become sui causa, we shed the shackles of fear, not because the dangers vanish, but because we realize our power lies not in controlling the unpredictable outer world, but in mastering the predictable inner one. The final move is simple, yet revolutionary. Stop being an effect. Start being the cause. Comment.